Let's continue talking about classical conditioning. We're going to talk about some of the additional research that was done on classical conditioning. First, let's talk about Watson. Sorry, his face is totally covered here, but oh well. J.B. Watson, John B. Watson, he was named the chair of psychology at Johns Hopkins University. He made a measly $3,500 a year. And what he did is he brought in this idea of behaviorism. And so he wrote 3 sentences that would become known as the Behaviorist Manifesto. The first thing he said was that psychology's content, so what psychologists study, should be the behavior, okay, the observable behavior. The methods of psychology should be objective, so we should do experiments, rather than introspective, like thinking about why this might happen. And then 3, its goal should be the prediction and control of behavior rather than understanding what our brain is actually doing. Basically, he's saying that we should take the brain out of it. Like, we should take those mental processes out of it. All we should be studying are people's observable behaviors. Behaviorism became very popular, and he was elected the president of the American Psychological Association in 1915. Watson is most famous for his little Albert experiment. And so what this was is that Watson and Rayner, his assistant, conditioned fear in an 11-month-old child. Little Albert is what we called him. It's not his real name, but that was his name for the experiment, okay? So what they did is they rang a gong, okay, or made a very loud noise, and then they elicited fear. However, they also presented Albert with a mouse, and they saw that there was no response. So our gong is our unconditioned stimulus, right? The fear is the unconditioned response. And then the mouse is the neutral stimulus, and then no response, obviously, to that. So what they did is they paired the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, same procedures we've been doing with classical conditioning. So mouse was then put, and then a gong was rang when the mouse was put in the hands of little Albert. So mouse plus the noise elicited fear. Okay. Eventually, after this was repeated multiple times, the mouse now became a conditioned stimulus, and it elicited fear, our conditioned response. The same thing that happened with Pavlov's dogs, except with different stimuli. Okay. So little Albert was conditioned to be afraid of furry white mice. Okay? What happened is that he generalized this fear. Little Albert generalized this fear of the white rat or mouse to other furry or fuzzy items like Santa's beard, a fur coat, a white rabbit. Okay? So he generalized this fear. The reason why this is said to be one of the most unethical experiments of all time is because Albert and his family moved away before Watson could really uncondition this fear. So people are like, oh my gosh, this poor little child is going to grow up and be afraid of all furry white things. However, most psychologists agree now that more than likely little Albert did not remain afraid of furry things. Why? Well, because of what we talked about before, extinction. Okay, if Watson was not continuing to strengthen that response, that conditioned response of fear, by presenting the white rat with the gong, then it would more than likely go away over time. Okay, so this extinction would happen over time. So let's talk about the rise and fall. So after his experiment with little Albert, Watson became involved with his assistant, Rayner, and this was not tolerated. So he was forced to retire from research in psychology, and he did become employed with J. Walter Thompson advertising agency, where he used his psychological techniques to start to sell products. This was kind of the first time that psychologists were really brought in to sell products, to use these ideas to sell products. Basically what he showed was that people's preferences between two products, between rival products, were not based on their sensory qualities, right? Not based, so like Coke and Pepsi wasn't based necessarily on the taste of Coke and Pepsi, but the associations that those people made with those two products, Okay, so some of the examples. Maxwell House coffee. He utilized this idea, and he began popularizing the idea of a coffee break. Okay, so coffee break and relaxation, and now you're associating those two together, and you need Maxwell House coffee. Pond's cold cream. He used testimonials from the queens of both Romania and Spain, and this was the association between the queen and the lotion. So they would get those. And then Johnson's baby powder, he convinced mothers to use the powder after every single diaper change. So in 1958, Watson was awarded the gold medal for his contributions to psychology because he did teach us a lot about conditioning, right? Much of what we know about counter conditioning, about phobias and other anxiety disorders, basically what that idea is that if you're afraid of snakes or something along those lines, we can be taught to respond in a relaxed manner to that conditioned stimuli until eventually that conditioned response of fear or anxiety is extinct. Okay, so he taught us a lot about counter conditioning. And his ideas also led to research in taste aversion, which we've talked about previously. And so most of what we know about making associations with things has come from Watson. Okay, so let's talk about extending Pavlov's work. Pavlov and Watson considered consciousness or the mind, okay, so our mental processes, not fit for the study of psychology, basically because we can't see it, right? We don't know what's happening. It's not objective. So the problem is that they both underestimated the importance of this cognitive process and our biological restraints on learning. And so cognition's influences became this big idea. This is the idea that we're not robots. We think. Okay. Early behaviorists like Watson and Pavlov believed that behaviors of various animals were just mindless mechanisms, that they were things that we learned over time and it just happened. But Rescorla came along and he said, yeah, that's mostly correct, but it's too limited. We think, right? We have brains and they allow us to do things. We're not robots. We're not just trained to do one thing after another. And so Rescorla came up with the contingency model of cognition. Okay, and the contingency model is that A is contingent upon B. A depends on B and vice versa. In other words, the presence of the conditioned stimuli, okay, so the bell in Pavlov's dogs, must predict the presence of the unconditioned stimuli, food, or else there won't be a response. Okay? Learning occurs in situations where the relationship between those two, conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, is clear and predicted. It's expected. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So for 3 days straight, whenever the phone rings in my class, it's for you, and they're called to the office. Okay, the next day, when the phone rings in class, you get out of your seat and you begin to head out the door to the office. Why? Because you assume the phone call is for you and you need to go to the office. Because A, the phone ringing is contingent upon being called to the office. Because whenever A happens, B occurs. Whenever the phone rings, you're called to the office. So phone ringing is contingent upon you going to the office. Let's change it a bit to kind of understand this a little bit better. For those same 3 days, whenever the phone rings in class, a different student is called to the office. The very last call was for you. Would you assume when the phone rings on the 4th day that it was for you to go to the office? No, you're not going to get up. Why? Because there isn't a strong connection. It's not predictable between the phone ringing and you being called to the office. One event isn't predicting the other. Okay? Our reactions are not just like knee-jerk reactions. We need to expect that something is going to happen. And that's what Rescorla is saying, that yes, these conditioned responses happen, but in order for them to continue to happen, we need to expect that something else is going to happen too. Okay? And that's where cognition comes in, that we think about things. We make those connections.